قاعنا متدمرة.
This double threat of climate change and war pushes people out of their homes, breaks food and supply chains, amplifies diseases, and weakens healthcare services. By 2050, the need for humanitarian aid is expected to double if urgent steps are not taken. We cannot let this happen. Climate funding and action must reach people in conflict zones. Climate change affects us all, but those living with this double threat can't be left to face it alone.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the panelists for being displaced while that video was playing. So I want to turn now to the panelists to ask a few questions, and I'm going to start with you, Adenike. So you created the youth-led Fridays for Future movement in Nigeria and advocate passionately on Lake Chad. So in your region, how do you see conflict and climate change intersecting, and how is this affecting children's learning? And I'll make sure I give you a microphone so that everybody can hear you. Can we just test that you're audible?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So I'm from Nigeria, and the connection between climate and conflict is direct. And this is how it plays out. We have the Lake Chad shrinking, and it has been shrinking by 90%. And then we have about 10.7 million people displaced, and as well, livelihood being affected. So the climate crisis exacerbates or fuels the conflict in such a way that people become vulnerable to join armed group of people like the Boko Haram and then become perpetrators of violence in their community. A very big example was the one that happened in 2014, where about 276 schoolgirls were adopted from their school in Chibok State, Borno State in Nigeria. So that incident brought an international outcry of bring back our girls. And this crisis shows how deeply the education is affected in conflict-affected areas. And this is where we have hotspot on climate issue. The Lake Chad is shrinking, people are being displaced, and their livelihood is being lost. And so the vulnerability increases people to join this dangerous group of people and become perpetrators of violence. And how it ties or affects children is the fact that for boys and girls, it impacts them differently. For boys, the young children, if they don't have school to go to, or if they are not in the classroom, then they are being recruited to join this dangerous group of people. And so this is why it's important that the funds for education cannot wait. It's impacting the life of young people, making them to actualize their dream. And for girls' child, then they are forced to get married as a dangerous survival strategy because the family wants to have livelihoods, and so they use the child brides from the girls' marriage to fund their family. And so that is a dangerous survival strategy for young girls not to be in the classroom, to be married early than expected. So those are the connections that you could see, that if children are not in the school or in the classroom, then it's a dangerous thing for the community or the society. And so that is why education plays a great role, because when children are educated, then they become technicians, doctors, begin to provide solutions. And everyone have a role to play, from the government to the donors to the society itself, helping to actualize the dream of young people. In Nigeria, we have the highest number of out-of-school children, which is disturbing. And that is why it's also important that we also raise funds for us to see that more people or young people go to school. And in Nigeria, in the context, we could see that we have multiple issues of climate crisis, from flood to drought to heat wave, food insecurity. All of this ties to what fuels the conflict in the region, and as well affect education, because once there is flood, then the children cannot access their classroom or they become displaced. And those hours or those days that they are unable to go to school, for some, it could be a point of no return to them. They might not be able to gain that number of days that they have left the school, which become a loss and damage issue. So just as we have the loss and damage crisis, it also affects the education sectors. And so before this crisis become permanent or become irreversible, it's important that we raise the funds that are needed to get as many young people or children to go to school. So this is an important aspect, because going to school or being educated is a direct way of solving the climate crisis, bringing about peace, security, and also helping us to achieve sustainable development goals. So, and at the same time, I've joined movements like the Fridays for Future, and also I own an NGO called the I Lead Climate Action Initiative. All of these are aimed at bringing about support towards climate action and also how we could drive about sustainable development. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Adenike. And you are such a passionate advocate for climate change and that linkage to conflict and education. And I think that's something that we're not seeing enough of that in this debate around climate change and in these discussions. And I think one of the things that we've done as Education Cannot Wait, we've funded an organization called the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, GCPEA, on new global research which looks at this topic, and we're very glad to launch that report today. And I hope that we have the QR code will be appearing shortly, if not immediately on the screen. So this research, we're launching that today as part of this session. We're launching that research that's been done by the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. And it really looks at these converging impacts of climate change, of conflict, and the impact on education. And before I turn to the other panelists, just want to give you three quick sort of takeaways from that report. I think, first of all, the data in that report makes it crystal clear, this linkage between climate change, conflict, and education. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in 2022 and 2023, over 2/3 of conflict-affected countries with attacks on education were also experiencing extremely high risks of climate and environmental hazards on children. So this connection, this linkage between climate change and attacks on education is very clear. The second thing, and I'm sure we are seeing this, and we've seen this since Education Cannot Wait was created in 2016, the number of emergencies, the number of crises is proliferating, to an extent that we could never have imagined when we were created. And we see this continuing along with the rise in global temperatures and this impact on conflicts. I think simultaneously with that, there's also the rise on attacks on education in these crisis and conflict affected areas. So that's the second output from the report. And this research brief is really an important contribution to this whole discussion around this linkage between climate change, conflict, and education. So I want to hand over to you now, John, from IFRC, because you have a global perspective, right, on the critical role in responding to complex emergencies, and including those, arising from this convergence of conflict and climate change. And you're an active leader in a number of sort of climate and conflict initiatives, from local to the sort of global level, the UN Secretary General's early warnings for all initiative to a community-based disaster risk reduction in all types of countries. So the question then is, in these contexts where both conflict and climate-related disasters have severely impacted education systems, how has the IFRC supported schools and communities to prepare for these compounded risks?
Thank you so much, and it's a huge privilege to be here today. And we're really excited. I think we've been in conversations with yourselves at Education Can't Wait for the last year or so, and it's sparked an awful lot of fresh ideas for us and some good challenges. Might just very quickly reflect. Very early on in my career, I worked in a kind of rural setting in kind of southeastern Africa, where there was internal conflict, climate change. And I think just something that you said really resonated with me. I remember asking kind of, what are the impacts apart from reductions in food security, kind of lost livelihoods, and ultimately kind of very strong health impacts. And people said, oh, well, our daughters, they're disappearing. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, they're getting married. And I said, okay, so at what age? What's happening? And they said, around 11 or 12. And it's about 5 kilos of maize, was what they were saying. And so these were the desperate choices that these people were making. And still, when I think about it now, I still get quite emotional, because I thought, well, okay, so this is worsening drought, it's conflict. So I suppose it's quite strange that someone from my kind of perspective from the UK to talk about the impacts in places where I'm not from. But I think it resonates with all of us that in these locations where climate and conflict are kind of interlinked and hitting the ground, the real impacts of people, their future outcomes, their life outcomes are incredibly difficult. And I'm very humbled to see people in the audience here who are far more expert in some of these things than me. And for example, Amir, who's helping to organise this, who's just disappeared, maybe you knew I was about to talk about him, wrote a brilliant report called kind of focused in West Africa. And in it, there's this great quote from a farmer there, I think from Niger, he said, I know that the livelihood I have now, which I think was based on rain-fed agriculture, is not going to be the livelihood I will have in the future. And he said, and it basically said, my children, what are they going to do in the future? So we've got these compounding impacts of incredibly difficult situations, incredibly intersectional vulnerability, particularly affecting children in these contexts where not only the challenges for adaptation are huge, but also if they're not able to be in school, how on earth are we going to reimagine what it is that people can do for work, right? How are we going to actually get out of this? So we're really excited to see the incredible work that our national societies are doing. It's kind of blossoming. I think in the past with some risk stuff like this, we would have kind of used a bit of a knowledge deficit model. If you know what we know, you do what we do. But I think as ideas around education are changing, particularly around sustaining it in emergencies, thinking about what it is around learning, we're doing new things. So one particular thing I'm very excited to kind of talk about is this huge potential for how do you use things like early warnings for all, early warning type initiatives. How do you use moments like this to stimulate agency within children and within schools? So we've got great ideas to put weather stations in schools, because as you start thinking about stuff, you start acting on it, this kind of citizen science approaches. So I think we're at this critical moment of critical vulnerability, but also huge potential with some intentionality to really start changing it. Of course, it's not going to solve everything, because these contexts, the problems are way bigger than all of our collective solutions, even for big organizations. But I think with these kind of ideas where you give and help with empowerment of young people to have new ideas, because we need new ideas, this will be part of the kind of critical solution out of it. So we're very excited, quite a long journey. Please do talk. We've got a couple of Climate Centre colleagues like Catalina Jaime from our Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre. Please do talk to Catalina about this after the event. But yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks very much, John. Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of that spirit around innovative approaches to some of these issues, and particularly on that focus, that greater and greater focus on anticipatory action, I think is really something that we are also seeing from our side in investing in that, so that we're really building, not just being able to respond to emergencies created by climate change and conflicts as a result, but also able to build that resilience moving forward and that ability to cope with those shocks. Thank you very much. So Lena, I want to hand over to you from Denmark. So how does Denmark see the interconnectedness between climate, conflict and the right to education, and what's Denmark doing?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. No, thank you. I just wanted to say also, I was also inspired by both your speeches here, because I just returned from 4 years in Tanzania, and now back in Europe. I know it's not conflict zones and such, but there you see the consequences of climate change also very much all over the world. And you see actually the tension that is building up because of the lack of resources, the lack of the displacement and everything that happens because of the climate consequences. And also that children can't go to school. And I know, for one, I work mostly with the women and girls' rights and the consequences of not going to school and how it affects everyone's lives with the livelihood, the postponement of first marriage, the postponement of first pregnancy, all these things that can be prevented if girls go to school. They have a future. And it's the same with boys. And then if you add the conflict on top of it. Sorry, I was just recapping my past 5 years of working with this in Tanzania. Yeah, no, but as you probably all know, Denmark sees education not as only as a fundamental right. We do see it as essential for building resilience and peaceful societies. It is children caught in the nexus between conflict and climate change. They're the most at risk of not having their rights fulfilled. And this is, as I just said, it just enhances the chances of early marriage, forced marriages, and joining an armed group. And it then becomes this vicious cycle of aggravating factors that can be stopped if we actually do work with children in schools. And this is why we have to address both climate change and conflict and how they intertwine, so that we can ensure that both children, but also their families, have access to quality basic social services. And that is both education, but also others. And Denmark is also a very stout supporter of leaving no one behind, and the rights-based approach, which is sort of the fundamental of everything we do in our work. And then when it comes to education and other critical social sectors, we make an effort to target those in the most vulnerable situations. I don't like to call them vulnerable groups, but because they are strong groups with lots of agency, but they become in vulnerable situations, right? And they're the most at risk of these effects. We see how climate change in itself can amplify these things, and then when you put conflict on top of it, it then double amplifies, and then children and getting disrupted in we can lose. We've seen. I don't want to make this into any particular crisis, but we've seen crises where we lost whole generations due to conflicts and not going to school, and then what when they grow up? What we do is we don't implement. So we implement through GPE and Education Cannot Wait, and UNICEF and other good partners who we also work with the what do you call it? IFRC, yeah, and others who work at the local level to where it actually matters. It's important to advocate here, but to work with the Lego Foundation, everyone to make sure that children do have a chance to go to school even in difficult situations. That will build resilience. It will ensure children access to safe learning spaces. And I think, to be honest, I don't know whether Education Cannot Wait do this, but as you were just saying before, that start already in the schools with climate action clubs, with getting these news ideas and the children becoming aware of the importance of this, so that they take it with them when they grow up and in their action. I think is a very good place also to start. And I think this is why we also support Education Cannot Wait and their climate appeal last year. So thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you.
Yeah.
Especially thank you to the government of Denmark, one of the largest donors to Education Cannot Wait and our trust fund. And I think just to respond to your question, there, yes, I mean the programs that we fund using your money are designed at country level by local level actors, and one of those things that's starting is exactly that infusion into that work around climate sensitivity in the classroom, both in and outside the classroom, and it's happening at various levels and various scales, and it depends on people like Odiniki as well and her climate advocacy to work. So thanks again for that. I want to sort of end, sort of as we close out this panel on a kind of solution building note. And before I turn back to the panelists for their sort of final thoughts, I want to just go back to this policy brief that I mentioned earlier from the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. And I do believe the QR code is up. So please, yeah.
We're in the way again.
Oh, no, it's okay. I think there's one. Oh, maybe if we can have it up here, if that's possible, that would be great, so that everybody can get access to the QR code. The technicians are working on that. I mean, so just briefly on this report, it does set out some worrying data. I mean, that's true, but it also includes some actionable recommendations and some promising practices, and provides some useful resources. And just want to share 3 of those recommendations. The first one, which we continue to advocate along with GCPEA, is really that governments should sign up to the Safe Schools Declaration. And implement that in a climate sensitive way. That's a really, coming to your point, Lena, that sort of local level engagement and government signing up to that, and then there's a declaration for the Safe Schools Declaration and that climate sensitivity. That's a first step. I think the second point that comes out of that report is really that responses that tackle multiple crises are far more effective than those that just tackle one crisis. So looking at that from a kind of multi-sectoral, multi-crisis angle is far more effective. And then thirdly, and this is really the sort of the forward-looking part of the report, that new and better mapping of climate events against patterns of attacks on education will better inform anticipation, prevention, and sustainable safe responses. So really that focus on data as a way to mitigate the impacts of both climate change and that impact on conflict moving forward. So my final question to each of the panelists in turn is, what are your 3 specific calls to either government, donors, civil society to effectively address the climate conflict education nexus? And maybe we can start with you, Lena, as soon as you ended, and work our way back.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. I think that Denmark, of course, will continue to support education. But we also, from 1st January 2025, Denmark is have a seat in the Security Council as a non-permanent. We will work definitely for the children and armed conflicts, and that is included. When it comes to attack and use of schools in conflict, I mean, 1 of 6 grave violations. I wonder this. It's not. Oh, like this.
Yeah,
okay, sorry. Okay, I don't know whether I'm a quite loud speaker, so maybe you heard anyway. No, but we will use our time in the Security Council also to have focus on this.
Terrific.
Yeah, and then I think what is also important is we just had a study made. Now I don't have a smart QR code, but of the linkages. It's not particularly focused on conflict, but on the link between education and climate change, where it was a desk study on what is there, because the lack of data and the lack of So this will also come in handy so that it can be, you can make policies and programs and stuff based on things you know that works and what is there and what will happen to make it more effective. And we just had and I don't know whether how it's possible to share. You can find it on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, but of the interlinkages between climate change and education. And then, of course, last year at COP28, aside from the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace, Denmark also became the signatory to the Declaration on the Common Agenda for Education and Climate Change. And we were proud to announce our contribution of 45 million Danish kroner to the Education Cannot Wait's climate appeal. I think we were the first donor to actually to contribute to the appeal, and I think that my colleague Line, who sits with Education Cannot Wait, told me how this will fund action pilots in Pakistan and Somalia, testing how to act early to reduce disruption to learning, minimize damage to schools, and keep children learning when severe climate events strike. So we look very much forward to learning about whether these pilots can what the outcome will be of that. And then we of course will use this opportunity to call on other donors to consider supporting the targeted efforts through Education Cannot Wait or others on climate change and education. So that would be. I will end with that. Perspective, not only government donors, but different kind of donors. Thank
Terrific.
you.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you for pivoting that a bit towards the financing piece, which I'll come back to at the end. And yes, that work, that funding that we've got from the Danish government to support those anticipatory action pilots in those countries is groundbreaking for us. And we are, thank you for sort of blazing the trail on that fundraising and supporting that approach, and we would like to see other donors sign up to that, and we have copies of the Right Here, Right Now appeal, which the government of Denmark responded to, and happy to circulate those. John, over to you for your top three priorities.
Great. So, I mean, I can't resist a bit of a pun, so I'll stick with learn, and learn.
Okay.
But in all seriousness, so the first one, so like, we know there's incredibly clear evidence for things like hand-washing campaigns after emergencies, not just that it protects kids from communicable diseases, but they go home and tell their parents, the wider family, and it's incredibly strong efficacy for that. So I want us all to learn again, to maybe slightly reimagine. Imagine if you have a weather station in a school, right? And I look here, I see my good friend Ahmed, who's Maldivian Met Agency. So imagine you have a weather station in a school that links with the meteorological agency. The children in school are interested in the science, they use their weather station. Maybe they start monitoring the heat in the school. There's 400 million children, I think, since 2022 that have been missed education because of extreme weather events. I mean, it's crazy. If we add conflict to that, absolutely crazy. So imagine this weather station. What benefits do you get from that? Well, you might get people re-engaging with stuff. You might get the school children thinking, okay, well, can we plant trees? Can we make it a better space? Okay, fine, trees are great. Maybe they don't get all the way there through the extreme heat. Well, great, we can link it to the warnings from the Met Agency, we can link it to anticipatory action, and so across the whole spectrum of shock, all the way from stressors through to shocks, we can make the whole system work together. And that's the kind of final learning thing. It's like, how can we learn from previous emergencies, learn together about this and do new things, and then really learn how to integrate this all together. And I think we have a critical opportunity to do it, building on the energy that young people have for climate change, to do something a bit differently across this kind of layered investment that we have.
Terrific. Thanks very much, John. That's a beautiful segue, referring to young people and the work that they do. Over to you, Adenike, for your sort of top three priorities from your unique perspective on climate change, conflict, and education.
Okay, so I'm glad that there's a direct connection, or the connection between climate change and conflict is recognized. I think that's the first approach towards solving an issue, recognizing the problem in the society, and that way it helps better to solve the crisis. And so my direction will be to the government because it's important. And I will also say that every actor also matters. From the government to the society to the donor, everyone matters. And so precisely talking about the government, their relationship with those affected people in the community is also important so that external forces doesn't seize that opportunity or those gaps that are missing between the government and the communities. And so government stepping in using the donor fund to channel towards safe schools, building resilience for the school is also very important because we know how important it is for us to build a strong and lasting structures for school to be able to withstand the threat of the climate crisis. And also youth empowerment. It's important towards skills acquisitions because these skills become a life-lasting tools that they could use in the society so that they don't get distracted or being vulnerable to join harm group of people and become perpetrators of violence. So amplifying those tools for young people will be very important and keen towards safeguarding the community and the nation as well. And also for to donors also to keep amplifying the work that they're doing because this is important to see that these funds are also used to do something great and to build sustainable development. And so those funds matter. Every fund that is investing, it's making the dream of young people to become a reality. Imagine that the millions of those people out of school becomes or go to classroom. So imagine the number of dreams that will be realized. Imagine the number of change makers or the society that will be transformed towards making those dreams to become actualized. And so that is why I mention or emphasize that everyone have a role to play, from the government to the citizen to the donor and to the civil society, trying to amplify this issue, raising the awareness, making it visible to the society that we have a problem, but this is how we could solve it so that everyone become the solution providers and no one is left behind. Thank you.
Terrific. Nikki, thank you very much. Thank you. We have a little bit of time. We were actually due to have a fourth panelist from the government of Somalia, unfortunately, who wasn't able to make it. So I wanted to just use the time just to see from the floor. I assume we're not able to take questions and comments from those online, but for those of you in the room, if you have any comments, questions, reflections on some of the things you've heard this morning. If not, I might turn back to the panelists just to check if there's any additional points you would like to make from your side. Yes, please, over to you. I think we've got a microphone here that we can... Thank you very much. And if you could please introduce yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Carolina. I am from the World Resources Institute. I am from Colombia. That is also a country, a lovely country in South America, where we are very vulnerable to climate change. But also, as many of you know, we are in a conflict territory because of illegal economies, as narco-traffic and other illegal economies. So what we are doing, because I have an example, is that we are working with public school teachers, and we give them a toolbox so they can be former or formers. So what we are doing is we are working with teachers of public schools in the Amazon, in the Pacific area, in the Caribbean, in the Andean region, so they can teach about to children about climate change. And this has been a beautiful experience because many teachers do not have the capacity building or they do not have the capacities to teach about climate change. No one turns to them to teach the teachers about climate change. So we are the first country in South America that we are looking for teachers to teach them about climate change and how they can impact all the students that they have. So of course we would like to present and if everyone is interested, we love to present our toolbox for teachers, for public school teachers in rural and urban areas in climate change. Thank you very much.
Very much indeed. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name because I didn't have my headphones. Carolina. Carolina, thank you very much for your comment. I think it sort of builds on your point, John, about learning, I think, and how we can, take some of these innovative approaches and using the resources that are there to amplify these messages. I mean, I think one of the things that we find from Education Cannot Wait, we focus specifically and deliberately on those children, those places left furthest behind. So emergencies and often protracted, forgotten crises. And what we see in the majority of these situations, even in the most difficult contexts. Last year, for example, I visited Chad, where there were Sudanese refugees had crossed over into the border, over the border into Chad. They'd crossed over into a part of Chad that had absolutely nothing. There was no infrastructure, no villages. It was actually the desert. There was very little vegetation, nothing for them. Yet even in that community that crossed over, a number of things. First of all, the demand for education was enormous. We asked the families, what are your needs? They just crossed the border 24 hours previously. The first need was water, because they weren't able to carry the water with them. But the second need on that list, they had fled that conflict in Sudan. Admittedly, that's not a climate-induced conflict, but just to highlight this need for education from those communities was incredibly high. And secondly, the capacities in those communities, already from those that had crossed over, was enormous. There was capacity already at that level, building on your point, around teachers who'd crossed over, who were keen to continue to work with those children. I just want to hand over, over to you, Lena. Yes. Yes, please.
Do you work with teachers?
Yes.
Because I thought that was a very good point you had, that of course it's not enough to have climate clubs in schools and weather stations if there's no one to teach how to use them and stuff. So do you work with teachers?
Oh, a huge amount. Yes, we have so one of the priorities in our strategic plan is a significant focus on teachers. We're through the programs that we fund, there is a deliberate and intentional focus on teachers and trying to understand, what skills do they have, where are those gaps, how can we work with governments to skill those teachers up, and particularly more and more. And I think one thing that's important to highlight, when Education Cannot Wait was created in 2016 and we had our first strategic plan, climate change was very it was not highly referenced in that strategic plan. However, our new strategic plan, which started last year, it's a significant component. It has an entire chapter of that strategic plan, and so that impact of climate change and this intersection with conflict and the impact on education in emergencies has been really quite significant. I just want to check how we're doing on time and how we're doing from around the room. We're right. Okay, good. I just want to check if there are any more thoughts, comments, reactions from people in the room. Yes, please. Over to you, sir. Where did I put my...
Hi, I'm Ahmed from the Maldivian Red Crescent and the Met Service as well. Just reflecting on some of the discussions around climate change and the shocks to the education system, especially talking about SIDS and low LDC countries, looking at the education system and from my own experience as well, the only way for the younger generation to go into higher studies is actually to explore education opportunities abroad. And now when there's a climate shock to the education system, the children actually go into a gap year, at least 1 or 2 years out of the formal education system. So it's really important to consider, it's not a question, just a thought process, on how these processes can be more flexible, where children who fall out of the formal education system can be welcomed back in, and also the opportunities from abroad for higher education can be more flexible for these disadvantaged group of children as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Any thoughts or reactions from the panel on that? Odinike, do you want to comment on that from a youth perspective?
Okay, so I think this is a reality in Nigeria, my country. And those are the gaps that are there. But looking at the fact that the work of education cannot wait, trying to give support to funds and other donor partner, I think it's a way that we could close that gap. Because some of those years that are waste, sometimes it could not be realized. And so those are the loss and the damage aspects of the impact of climate change on education, which makes it a reality. And so that is why there's a need for more funding towards this aspect, that children that are displaced or out of school are immediately given an immediate response that is needed to get them back to school as soon as possible. And sometimes it could mean creating more schools, or even dealing with those climate crises in itself, because some region or some communities are already lost due to the impact of climate change. And so it could also mean government trying to change the curriculum that suits into the enabling environment of the crisis, so as to bring as much solution on board as possible, and more innovations on climate education, or more on technological transfer that could also help schools to withstand the threat. And so these are issues that the climate change crisis pose, but there are solutions that we could bring on board that donors could also fund for immediate response. And so that is why we can't wait. When we see sometimes some promises of, we should wait for 2050, 2080, we can't wait. Because if we could wait by then there'll be more people out of schools. So we need to bring in as many as possible to go to school, because through that platform they could learn and get higher education to study wherever they want to study in the world. And so I think that is my response,
Thank you very much. Thanks, Odekunike, thank you. I'm going to bring this session to a close. I wanted to say, for a long time, as I mentioned just now, we have been talking about this intersection with conflict and its impact on education, and that's in terms of the emergencies angle and the protracted crises. This additional sort of aspect of climate change and its linkage with conflict is really something that we are together with partners exploring in Education Cannot Wait. And I think, building on what you just said, Odekunike, I feel, we describe ourselves in Education Cannot Wait as being unapologetically impatient. You're absolutely right. We cannot wait. We cannot procrastinate. We need to take action. And coming back to your point, Lena, and I want to sort of pivot and end, as a global fund, our primary objective is to raise resources. We need to raise funding for all the types of things that you were saying, Odekunike, about what actors are doing at the local level. One of the greatest shortfalls we see is financing. It's financing, and that's our specific niche, our specific role as a global fund is to mobilize those funds. And we're using the COP29 as a platform to articulate several messages on that I just want to end with. I think the first one, we do see a tremendous amount of climate-related finance available. It's there. However, only less than 1% of that is going towards education-related initiatives. And that's not enough. If we are to tackle climate change and its impact on conflict and its impact on education, we need to increase the access for organisations to those climate funds, and they need to be easier to access. So that's our first call to action on those climate funds, is make it easier, make it quicker to disperse that funding and get it out to those organisations that are working at the forefront. The second call to action is to call to the UNFCCC to prepare the loss and damage, or to circulate and finalise the loss and damage report that will give data on a number of these areas so that we can use that data to inform interventions moving forward. The third one is to include education in climate-induced emergency and disaster situations as one of the core result areas of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. It needs to be in that that funding mechanism for organisations to be able to access it. And then lastly, ensure that the new collective quantified goal on climate finance incorporates children's right to quality, safe, inclusive education, particularly in humanitarian settings, because that's the focus that we have as Education Cannot Wait. I want to end by saying please do access the report. You have the QR code. It's really critical. It's a great piece of research on that linkage between conflict, climate change and education. It provides some number of recommendations that I outlined earlier. Please do access it. Join our call to action. Join our call to fund Education Cannot Wait so that we can fund partners on the ground. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Thank you.